Throughout the 8 months of production, the issue of North Korea's nuclear ambition has dominated headlines all over the world. It is also on the minds of these North Korean families. Sung-yeon's father, a college professor, is well aware of the issues.
We teachers and comrades actually all recognize the fact that there's no need to make nuclear weapons. Of course, in circumstances where the Americans keep wanting to eat us up, there's a possibility that we may make weapons to defend ourselves against them. But instead of making the weapons for offensive purposes, we teachers know it's more important that we train and arm ourselves ideologically and dominate the enemy mentally. If there's one thing I have to say to the people of the world, it's never be afraid of us.
The Army veteran finds it hard to understand the hostility shown towards his country.
At the moment, we all live happily and freely like one family. But whenever we hear that outsiders are threatening to attack us, we think that this feeling of peace is being trampled on. These people must all want peace in the end, too. But I wonder, why do they interfere with other people's happiness? We're a simple and peace-loving people. But once somebody treads on our happiness, we'll answer them with a merciless blow.
It is 50 years to the day since an armistice brought 3 years of vicious fighting on the Korean peninsula to an end. In previous years, the anniversary has seen a mass game spectacular. But this year, North Korea's self-proclaimed victory over the United States was muted. There was no mass games. Kim Il-sung's statue is again the focus of remembrance, as it was he who led the nation through the war. Pride of place goes to a bouquet sent personally by his son, Kim Jong-il. At night, there may be no mass games, but the festivities center around the 30,000 adults who dance on Kim Il-sung Square. Yet there seems little to celebrate. 50 years after the war, a peace treaty has never been signed. Korea remains divided. The North is still seen as a pariah by the Western world, and the Korean peninsula continues to live with the threat of catastrophic war. Hyun-sun and her family can view the fireworks from their apartment. Throughout the night, they make their own entertainment. The next day, it's business as usual for the gymnasts. July is the start of the hot and humid season in Korea. School is out for the summer. Throughout the summer months, practice will be held all day. And the girls, Hyun-sun and Sung-yeon, continue to hone their skills for a future occasion when they can honor their leader.
Sometimes mass gymnastics training is hard. We train under the blazing sun while other kids play around. But we dedicate a huge amount of energy to give happiness to the dear general. Now our moves are almost perfect. When the beloved leader comes to watch the mass gymnastics, I'll definitely please him with perfect moves.
Wide Angle continues with Jamie Rubin.
Professor Armstrong, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here.
The families in the film, they seem to really show devotion to Kim Jong-il, the leader of North Korea. How real is that devotion?
I think for those people it is very real. And in fact, for many people in North Korea, devotion, even worship, if you want to put it that way, of the great leader and his son, the current leader of North Korea, is genuine. From the beginning of school, at the age of 5, one of the first things they learn, one of the first sentences school children in North Korea are taught is, thanks to the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung.
We saw one reality in the film, the reality of two families living in Pyongyang, but there's a different, perhaps less attractive reality outside of Pyongyang.
Well, this is one small slice of reality in North Korea. This is a privileged class of people. Only a small percentage of the population is allowed to live in Pyongyang. Most of those are people who are members of the party, who have good jobs. And people in Pyongyang are well-fed, relatively speaking. Most of the rest of the citizens of North Korea are living pretty Spartan, if not quite grim, lives of inadequate services and food and so forth. So
in prison camps and slave labor, or is that real?
There are probably prison camps in North Korea. One estimate is that there are perhaps 100 to 150,000 political prisoners in camps in North Korea. We certainly have heard a lot of defectors' testimony in recent years that paints a very grim and even horrifying picture of life in those camps. So that is another part of the reality of North Korea.
Do North Koreans have any tradition of understanding the outside world? Tell us a little bit about the history of this peninsula.
Well, you have to keep in mind that Koreans in North Korea have never experienced anything but authoritarian rule, and that's unique. They went straight from a very isolated and very authoritarian Confucian kingdom in traditional times, which was quite resistant to outside pressure and influences, to colonization by Japan from 1910 to 1945, which was very harsh, very militaristic, and also very isolated. It certainly had no elements of democracy at all. And then from there to Stalinism, to control by the Soviet Union, and essentially kind of adaptation of the Stalinist system to the North Korean environment.
In the film, we see a almost unreal description of the Korean War. Do North Koreans understand that North Korea started the war, and why do they think the war is still going on?
What North Koreans have been taught since the war began, what they said, in fact, immediately after the war started, is that the U.S. started the war. The U.S. and South Korea attacked across the 38th parallel. It's almost exactly the reverse of what really happened. Right. But there's no, since that's the only thing they've ever been taught, and most of the people who were involved in the war are now gone, that's probably what most people believe.
But through none of their lifetimes has there been any military conflict, so why do they really think the war is still on?
Well, fundamentally it's because Korea is divided. They see that their country, which they think should be one country, is divided into two. The American military is in the south. North Koreans are taught that South Korea is basically a puppet state of the U.S. run by the U.S. military. And that is the fundamental issue.
Why are they learning English in schools?
Well, the U.S. is the enemy, but English is the international language. So they're getting kind of contradictory messages from the leadership. They have to be prepared to fight the U.S., but they also have to learn business. And this is something quite new and recent that indicates there's a certain change of mentality about economic issues in North Korea, if not these political and geopolitical issues.
Well, let's talk about the nuclear crisis. North Korea is obviously a very poor country. Why do they want a nuclear weapon? Why is that so crucial to the regime?
Well, what's crucial to the regime is their self-defense and what they see as a very hostile environment. Over the last 10 years or so, they seem to have become convinced that a very good way to defend your country without utilizing a lot of scarce resources is nuclear weapons. And in the meantime, they've seen India and Pakistan go nuclear without any serious repercussions, so they probably feel that they should be able to get away with it too.
So it's defense on the cheap, nuclear weapons?
Exactly, it's deterrence as they see it.
Do you think North Korea will ever give up their nuclear weapons capability?
I think that they will give it up for the right price, as it were. I think that they will always want to have some reserve potential to develop a nuclear deterrent if necessary. But in the meantime, I think they would be willing to freeze or even dismantle their current program, or most of it, in exchange for some kind of security assurance that makes them feel that the U.S. is no longer the kind of hostile power that it has been, whether it's a peace treaty or other sort of guarantee from the U.S. of non-aggression. And the other is, as they put it, the U.S. not hindering their economic development.
Some outside analysts and some even in the Bush administration have suggested that we can provoke the collapse of North Korea, that if we give them a little outside access, if we put the squeeze on the regime, if we sanction them, that somehow we can provoke a collapse. How likely do you think that is?
Well, look, in the late 1980s, we had a famine in North Korea, hundreds of thousands, perhaps 2 or 3 million people, 10% of the population, died of starvation, and the regime is still there. What would it take to get the regime to fall? And could we take the responsibility upon ourselves to provoke anything that catastrophic?
You've suggested that if we open up to North Korea, if we lift sanctions, if we penetrate their society, that's the most likely way in which the regime will change.
Exactly, and they seem to be willing to take that risk. So it's a risk on both sides. Are we willing to give them that opening which will help the regime in the short run in order to have serious and positive changes in the long run?
So you think North Korea's regime can collapse, but not by containment, not by sanctions, but by opening up to the West?
It might not collapse immediately, but it could certainly change in what most people would see as a positive direction, much more likely through opening than through pressure.
Let's say we can't come to an agreement and North Korea goes forward with its threat to test nuclear weapons, and the United States were to follow through on its declaration that this is intolerable. That would mean a military strike. Do you foresee that possibility?
It certainly is a possibility, and the North Koreans, in a way, have been preparing for that contingency for 50 years.
Can you envisage North Korea not responding to an American airstrike?
No, I cannot imagine that North Korea would accept an American airstrike and not retaliate. Exactly how they would retaliate, we don't know. Most likely they would send artillery against the south. They would try to hit American bases, possibly even in Japan. But they would certainly strike back. I can't imagine a scenario in which they would not.
So if you compared North Korea and Iraq, for example, where much of the Iraqi army and the regular army and the police just faded away during the last Gulf War, how different would that be, in your view, to a real military conflict between North Korea and the United States?
North Korea is not Iraq, and I think it would be a grave mistake to assume that it is. North Korea, first of all, is a country that has, in effect, been fighting a war against the United States for 50 years. I'm not saying that they would prevail over the U.S., but they would put up a much tougher fight than the Iraqi army.
This would be an ugly, nasty war.
This would be an ugly war that could result in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties.
Professor Armstrong, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.